Okay. This I've been on my show. It's called The Path of Science Fantasy, and on on my channel, I talked about it, but I'm not actually discussed what it is and what it truly means and what stuff of it is, like what things there are science fantasy and stuff. Um, Science fantasy, I think from the definition right, it's part of speculative fiction. I have a little trouble pronouncing that, but it's actually a mixed genre that is both science fiction and fantasy together. And stuff that is science fantasy is Star Wars, Doom, that's science fantasy. Uh, the video game Destiny is science fantasy. Guardians of the Galaxy is science fantasy. Thor Ragnarok is science fantasy. The movie. Let's see. Shadowrun science fantasy. The Palladium's Rift is science fantasy. Spelljammer from D&D is science fantasy. This is just off my head, but there's a good deal of stuff that's science fantasy, but I just can't remember them all. But things that are not science fantasy, if it has no fictional technology and something fantastical, it's not science fantasy. But you can do science fantasy in many ways. You don't have to have magic involved in it. You don't exactly have to have like high-tech technology. You could just have something that would be like fantasy in a modern era, and just simply have some kind of technology that runs on magic, and therefore being fictional science, which is fictional technology, and then magic itself making it science fantasy. Pretty much any way you can get any kind of fictional science, which is science fiction. True science fiction is fictional science. Anything that is scientifically fictional is science fiction. Fantasy is anything fantastic. Anything that is from myths, legends, or anything that is totally just something that can't be real no matter what. It's myth, it's legend, it's fantastical. Pretty much science fantasy is a mixture of both fictional science and fantastical stuff to make stuff that is science fantasy. And there's ways you can do things of science fantasy where you can have like maybe a thing where you have maybe a race of aliens invading a fantasy world. And maybe this fantasy world figures out the only way to beat the aliens is maybe use a certain type of magic. Like, I've actually done some times of playing outside when I was younger, and I started to get into science fantasy with my stepbrother. We actually played a thing where we were invaded by these like reptilian aliens, and it was in a world that was kind of half fantasy and half just normal world. And the normal world was just humans with like modern day technology and some normal swords that didn't real life swords. Then my world was more like highly advanced, but the aliens were a lot more advanced. But we also all have magic, and we only played that setting one time. But I had at the end that we helped drive back the aliens' invasion from the first time they invaded, which is the only time we played, by using a certain type of magic that in the history of our world that we made it just in a couple minutes that was forbidden because the humans didn't like us using it, and it was necromancy. And that's actually, I can go also into the topic of saying that necromancy may be a evil magic, but you can use it for good. Cause like I use it in that setting, I use it as using it as the dead bodies that were laying around to replenish the forces back and use dead soldiers to help fight back the alien invasion. Cause like, say you can do that in science fantasy. You can have aliens invading and using some kind of magic to force back the aliens. And I actually like the idea that you can do that. And I like how you can do that in science fantasy because I really think in most science fiction the whole aliens die of a disease or we beat them through pure force or luck or we're just having to hack the technology. I think that's a bunch of just ridiculously dumb because I know magic is a little ridiculous, but it's a little bit more better idea thinking that magic can beat the aliens than just we happen to be killing them from a disease or we beat them or we're able to overdeal their technology because if the aliens are adventurous, we probably ain't gonna be able to outsmart them, outfight them, or outbeat them, or outdo their tech because they're more advanced than us. And if they come from a world, that world had life on it. If it had life, it had diseases. So they should be already immune to a disease. And plus, they got advanced technology. They've probably got medicine and ways to cure that disease. So I don't see how in science fiction, the movies that do that are good movies. I like them, but that's a dumb way to do it. But in science fiction, you pretty much don't got a choice because without being science fantasy, you can't have magic. That's why I like science fantasy better because in science fantasy, you can have magic that beats the aliens instead of trying to just BS it as in aliens died of the disease or you just having to figure out a way over the attack because that should not be possible. It'd be more possible aliens getting beat by some supernatural force that aliens never seen before because magic is more likely something that in a fictional universe not be more rare than just diseases or some really smart person.